One of the things that makes the Sabbath so appealing is just the idea of having rest and having time with family and friends and having time where you're resting and recouping and just being with God.
I think Sabbath is appealing simply because it makes me stop and put things down that I need to just focus on the Lord a little bit more.
I think because life is so hectic and crazy and so much going on all the time, that the idea of setting time apart to be present with people, present with God for an extended time, resting and in relationship is appealing.
It's just a reminder to me that God is actually in charge. This is His world, these are His people, and it's a gift from Him to us to just rest and trust that He is our shepherd and He will lead us.
It's so hard to just stop. We tend to want to fill any empty time with media or distractions. It's really hard to just be still.
Just with life getting so busy, it's just hard to sometimes set apart that day or that time.
It's also difficult because our culture doesn't practice it as a whole, and so it's really hard to stop and slow down and not do things when everyone else around you is.
At a root maybe is a trust that God's created Sabbath for us, and that the benefits of that outweigh the fear of missing out or the FOMO of all the things that we would need to set aside in order to practice that.
Hello, church. Wherever you are watching this, I'm glad you're part of Sabbath in a Box Sunday. I right now might be on my way to Chicago. I might be sitting in an airport. I actually could be on a plane headed to Alaska. I'm in a very busy season of my life where I have the opportunity to travel. I don't love traveling because every step along the way, I'm wondering, am I going to get there on time? And am I going to get there on time? And it stresses me out. I love being other places. I just don't love traveling to other places. So wherever I'm at, hopefully I'm on time. Wherever you are, hopefully time is standing still for you. That's the gift of Sabbath. It's an opportunity to slow down. It's an opportunity to enjoy God's peace, His gift, and hopefully do it with others. So you might be sitting at the church. You might be at home. You might have been listening to this on YouTube while going for a walk. I don't know how you're taking this in. The beauty of this gift is Sabbath Sunday, or Sabbath in a Box, allows you to take your time and experience Sabbath. And this is something we really need. There's an author named Mark Buchanan who wrote a wonderful book called The Rest of God. And he says the one law, if we don't live it out, it's going to kill us, is the Sabbath law. Let me read a quote from Mark Buchanan. It's killing us. Our worry, our hurry, our need to gather one more armload of brushwood, that's a reference to Numbers 15. Our haste to get out of the doctor's office and back in the fast food lane. We take our rat poison to thin our blood clots and scurry back to the rat race to clot our blood some more. The death verdict is inscribed in this way of life. Now, perhaps that sounds a little dire, maybe too dramatic, but what Buchanan has noticed is that the relentless pace of life, if we let it take hold, is going to eventually undo us. Sabbath is a gift, it's a pause, it's a stop. Every 6 days, we work. Every seventh day, we rest. That's part of God's rhythm. So we're going to talk about Sabbath today. We're going to be in a passage from Luke chapter 6. And just as a reminder where we've been in Luke, we've been walking through the teachings and the healings of Jesus early on in Galilee. We've seen that He teaches with power. We've seen that He does these works of wonder. And so far, people have been amazed, and He's recruited some disciples, but we also saw a couple weeks ago His first critics or opponents show up. I mean, He got that in Nazareth, but He actually has had men coming from Judea and Jerusalem, the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, and they're coming to watch Jesus closely because news of His work and His words have spread, and they're kind of concerned that He might be someone who's going to lead Israel astray or get them in trouble with Rome. So as we peek into this passage where Jesus teaches about Sabbath and teaches how he rules over Sabbath, we're also going to see some rising opposition from Jesus' ministry. So I'm going to read Mark chapter 6, the first few verses of this chapter. It says, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, 'Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?' Jesus answered them, 'Have you never read what David did and his companions when they were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priests to eat. And then he gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said to them,'" that's the Pharisees, "'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" This is the first of two stories, both with Sabbath at the center. Before I explain what's going on in this passage, I want to take a step back and look at Sabbath on the whole. Sabbath was a key marker of Jewish identity. During the period that the Old Testament ended and the New Testament began, what we call the Second Temple period, the Jewish people had a bit of an identity crisis. And there were three things in the midst of this rebuilding of the temple, which had Herod's dirty fingers all over it, three things that identified the Jewish people as like truly good Jews. Number one, how they practiced Sabbath. Number two, that the men were circumcised. And number three, that they had specific dietary laws. These three items set the Jewish people apart. One, Sabbath. Two, circumcision. Three, their dietary laws. In fact, one commentator, when he looks at this, he says that the Jewish people had these in and out boundary lines that were determined by whether or not you followed these three rules. They were marks of solidarity. If you were a good Jew, you practiced Sabbath. If you were a good Jew and a male, you were circumcised. If you were a good Jew, you followed the dietary customs. So that's what's going on in this intertestamental period between the New Testament and the Old Testament. But let me take you all the way back to the beginning. Let's do a brief history of what the scriptures teach about Sabbath. For example, you don't go very far into our Bibles. Genesis chapter 2. The first three verses, and you have your opening reference to Sabbath. After God has finished this wonderful work of creation, it says here, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from his work. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." So the first one to ever practice Sabbath was Creator God. And we know that Creator God is Father, Son, and Spirit, so they are delighting in the work of their hands. This is a beautiful thing. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, when he talks about Sabbath, he says what happens is God's time and our time, they get connected. And we see this from the beginning of creation. It's not like God stopped doing things. Even Jesus talks about, "I do the work that my Father's doing." We're still working. But on the seventh day, it was a pause for God to say, "Look, isn't this wonderful? Look, let's enjoy this. Look, let's call this holy." So N.T. Wright talks about Sabbath as this sacred time. Let me read a quote from N.T. Wright. "The Sabbath day was a day when human time and God's time met. When the day-to-day succession of tasks and sorrows was set aside, one entered a different sort of time. Celebration, the original Sabbath, and looking forward to the ultimate one." So this day of rest that God set in place in the rhythm of creation, he says, look at what I've done and look forward to what I will do. Sabbath is sacred time. Now, you flip forward in your Bible and you find in Exodus, God has mandated Sabbath as part of the Ten Commandments. It's this pivot commandment that we find in our Bible. So I'll read this one to us as well, just so you can see how Sabbath was one of the key words of God in the original Ten Commandments. Here's what it says. It's also the longest one, and it's the hinge between commands that help us love God and commands that help us love others. Here's what it says. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your manservant, nor maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But on the seventh day he rested. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So you see in the Ten Commandments, rest and remember creation. That same commandment is repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, but there's a slight shift in it. It's rest and remember God saved you. So Sabbath is a great day to enjoy creation like the Trinity did. It's a great day to remember that God created like the Ten Commandments ask, to remember that we are saved. We don't save ourselves like Deuteronomy 5. And then you see the Sabbath law play out several times in the Old Testament. Moses practices it. The priests use it. It's an opportunity to give sacrifice to God, to be thankful to God. It's also something that builds. So not only do you have a Sabbath day, but you have a Sabbath year and then a year of Jubilee, and you're remembering that our God wants to set us free. The Sabbath was something that was for all people, so not just the man of the house, but sons and daughters, slaves and free, they all celebrated Sabbath. It was very inclusive. At least the way it was written, we don't know that it was always practiced that way. In fact, you continue to read through the Old Testament, and you have prophets condemning the people of Israel because guess what? You are not practicing Sabbath the way that God meant it. You're counting down the time on the clock, and as soon as it's over, you're selling things. You're missing the point, is what the prophets say. Isaiah said it. Jeremiah said it. Ezekiel said it. Amos said it. Hosea said it. Even Nehemiah, when they've rebuilt the temple and they're rebuilding the walls, they say, we need to remember the Sabbath, but you guys are missing it. Chapter 9 and forward of Nehemiah. So we see in the Old Testament, the Sabbath is this beautiful gift from God that he started, gave to people to be inclusive, to remember him. And then we have this intertestamental period where the Sabbath was one of the key markers of the Jewish people. And so when Jesus, in the book of Luke, is saying, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying something that's really troublesome. And when he's saying that it's lawful to do things that the Pharisees think is unlawful, it's very troublesome to the Pharisees. So you can see how this story causes them to feel a little bit bothered. It's worth noting as we go through this story in Luke chapter 6 that these Pharisees were not bad people. They just wanted to protect the religion. Rome was creeping in, and so they wanted to push the culture out. And so if they can keep the people as Jewish as possible, so they built onto the law layers of tradition. And if you dig in a little bit, you get to see what is lawful versus what is unlawful in the mindset of these Pharisees was a pretty big list. In fact, one New Testament commentator, he says that disputes over the law were part and parcel of Jewish life. In Judaism, divine law covered every aspect of life. In fact, this author, E.P. Sanders, he says that there were 7 levels of dispute about the law. And when you get to Sabbath laws, what Jesus is dealing with here, what's lawful? What can you eat? What's lawful? Can you heal a person in the next story? That's like right in the center of these 7 layers of dispute. So the debates among church people today about worship music, about politics, about which version of the Bible, this is nothing new. This goes back to Jesus' day. So Jesus is talking to these Pharisees. They have this giant list of things you cannot do. It is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And then Jesus says, no, that's not correct. You've missed the point of the Sabbath, and I am Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. The Pharisees were legalists. So let's just pause for a moment and think about this. Because maybe this Sabbath experience is uncomfortable for some of you. Shouldn't we have a preacher talking to us live in the room? Shouldn't we encourage everyone to gather every Sunday and be in the room? Like, this is a different way of doing things, and it can feel wrong. That feeling that you have is actually something perhaps called legalism. When your tradition is something you determine as right. Or the way I'll phrase it if you had sermon notes would be, legalists assume their rules are right. Legalists assume their rules are right. And listen, we're all guilty of this. Just outside my house, in front of our house, we have a curb. In the center of our yard is a tree. I have a particular rule. You either need to park behind the tree or you need to park in front of the tree. But sometimes my children park a little too far, and they have broken the rule. Now, I think I'm right, but that's just a man-made rule. Really what I am is a legalist, and this runs through me. We have these rules in our home. We have these rules in our workplace. We have these rules in church. And if you're feeling really uncomfortable with this Sunday, just know that that little part of you that feels like this is wrong, it might actually be legalism. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, and he allows us to try different ways of experiencing Sabbath worship. So a legalist assumes their rules are right. And Jesus is bumping up against this. Now here's the second story in Luke, chapter 6, picking up, and we are now in verse 6. Another Sabbath. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand up in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they, that's the Pharisees and teachers of the law, were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So I mentioned already the opposition toward Jesus is starting to mount. What Luke is doing in 3 successive stories, one from last week, 2 from this week, is he's showing that people are watching Jesus closely, and they are starting to create a case against him, and the people are doing that they're legalists. Their law and tradition, their interpretation of how things should go, they're going to hold over Jesus. Here they're furious. Earlier they were just kind of like befuddled. So you see this rising opposition. What's really interesting is the way that the Pharisees are described. It says they were sitting there. They were watching him closely to accuse him. And the word here that's used to describe is very vivid. It says they were looking out of the corner of their eye. It's almost like they were spying him. I think of a scene from Meet the Parents where Robert De Niro's character is like this. So you just envision the Pharisees in the room with Jesus. They're like, "I see what you're doing. I'm watching you closely." And Jesus, he's not bothered by this. In fact, he rises to the occasion. Now, here's the irony. He knows these debates about what's work and what's not on the law, and to save a life is not considered work. It's considered the right thing to do. So he uses their tradition against them, and he's saying, this is lawful. This is the same word that's used in the previous story. By the way, the word Sabbath shows up 6 times in these 2 stories. The phrase lawful shows up a couple times in these 2 stories. And it's part of this rising opposition. And Jesus is again saying, I am Lord of the Sabbath, and I want the Sabbath to be something that's for your good, for our good. And so that's at the heart of this debate here. The man whose hand is shriveled, it's shrunken. There's a later writing in the early church history that's not considered gospel or biblical, but it says this man was probably a Freemason who was working and got his hand crushed, and Jesus freed his hand. What Luke tells us is it was his right hand, and most people were right-handed. So this was his working hand. This was the hand that gave him his livelihood. If this man's right hand didn't work, then he couldn't work. And what's Jesus's form of work in this story of healing? He just asks a guy, stand up, you're healed. His version of work is so simple, it's so basic. Stand up, you're healed. In other stories, Jesus touches someone. Jesus might actually spit on dirt. And this, he gives his most effortless healing of all. And that's part of the irony of the story. And yet, the Pharisees, they're still really bothered by this. But we don't always like that. And we're back to the legalists here who are furious. Legalists, what they do is they set rules before relationships. Legalists set rules before relationships. And so Jesus is dealing with this. He's saying, I see this guy's need, and it matters more that I heal his hand than I follow all of your customs. I guess a modern day example of this, for the person who feels like they have to be at church all the time, sometimes it's better to not show up to church so that you can be with someone else who's at home at need. Maybe your family's having a really hard time and you decide on this Sunday we're going to stay home and just have a family day. And maybe that's what you did. Or maybe you use a Sunday to drive someone to the airport. That's what the Swains did. You're putting relationship before rules. Sometimes that relationship before rules is saying, you know what? I think the hymns are the best songs to sing, but honestly, if we want to reach the younger generation, sometimes we're going to learn their songs and we're going to present their songs because relationships are more important than rules. The legalist is like, no, we got to do it my way, and I don't care what other people think. So beware if that kind of creeps up in your heart. And so Jesus has an opportunity here. Can I heal this man and maybe cause some frustration from people? That's what he chooses to do because he puts relationship over rules. Now, all of this centers around the practice of the Sabbath. And the most critical element of the Sabbath that we see in this story is that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And so what I want to do here as we close out our time is I want to think particularly about what does it mean when we return to the original meaning of Sabbath, all that stuff we saw from the Old Testament. And remember that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. It's what he gives to us for our benefit. In fact, if you read these stories in Mark's version says, the Sabbath was not given as a rule to man, but for man to enjoy it. That's a paraphrase for it. It was a gift to us. And the Sabbath is a reminder to us that Jesus is the one who rules, not us. Not all of our rules, not all of our legalism, not all the work we get done to feel important, not all the work we get done because we're busy, but the Sabbath is an opportunity to pause, to reflect, and to remember that Jesus is the Lord. He rules. Or the way I phrase it, if you have your sermon notes, is we enter Sabbath rest to let Jesus rule. We enter Sabbath rest to let Jesus rule. I could even put that as a command, but I don't want to make it sound too ruly. But enter Sabbath rest. It's an invitation. Enter Sabbath rest to let Jesus rule. Too much we want to rule our lives. We want to set the agenda. We want to run our schedule. And Sabbath is God's invitation to say, hey, just take a day away from all the demands and be. So I want to talk about practicing Sabbath as a gift from Jesus to enjoy Jesus and to do that with other people. And I have a couple of ideas I want to share with you as it relates to Sabbath. And because this service is going to be shorter, or you're practicing this service at home or somewhere else, you can put these things into place today. In fact, I encourage you, today could be a day of salvation. Today can be a day where you meet Jesus. Let's do some of this stuff. First, hear the Sabbath invitation as an invitation. It's not a rule, it's not a duty, but it's an invitation. Marva Dawn, an author who writes extensively about Sabbath, says this: I do not invite you into a Sabbath keeping as an onerous duty, a burden like it seems to have become for many under the legalism of some Jews in the day of Jesus. Rather, I invite you into the most wonderful opportunity for experiencing God and the timelessness of the kingdom, for letting ourselves be reclaimed, revitalized, and renewed. These are three things she says happen when we practice Sabbath. Your life is reclaimed. Jesus is Lord. You're not the Lord of your life. It's revitalized. You're not exhausted. You get refreshed. You're renewed. You have new focus. You have new energy. You have new joy. Three things that come from Sabbath if you hear the invitation. And Marva Dawn, I said she writes extensively about Sabbath. She says you can really find four things in Sabbath. One, Sabbath is a time to rest. It's a time to cease. It's a time to feast. And it's a time to embrace. So, stop doing stuff today. Rest. Cease. Take a nap today. Right? Cease. Feast today. Eat some food that you enjoy. And then embrace. Be with people that you love. Hear Sabbath as an invitation. Here's a second thing to think about as it relates to Sabbath. Beware of imposter Sabbaths. You can look through church history, and in his book, Subversive Sabbath, A.W. Swoboda says that there are, that's a hard name to say, he says there are several imposter kinds of Sabbath. Here's one, donkey Sabbath. What's donkey Sabbath? Where you just you do nothing. You're a lazy butt on donkey Sabbath. Here's another imposter Sabbath. He calls it the golden calf Sabbath. You remember the story of the golden calf? It's a day of pure indulgence. It's not just about treating yourself on Sabbath, but you can pleasure stack. We'll talk about that momentarily. There's also the devil's Sabbath. The devil's Sabbath is where you take a day off from God and you do things that are sinful, or you do things that don't actually feed your spiritual life. They just kind of morph into culture. You're lied to. That's the devil's Sabbath. There's the Joshua Sabbath. Remember that day that stood still? And Joshua's like, when is this day ever going to end? That's called the Joshua Sabbath. And then lastly, there's the outward Sabbath. And that might be, if you put into practice some of the things we're talking about here in a moment, or the things you found in a Sabbath box, you go through all the motions, but you don't actually seek God in your heart. You don't actually try to rest. So it's external, it's not internal. So I want you to beware of the imposter Sabbath. I want you to hear Sabbath as an invitation, not as a duty. I also want you to find a rhythm and make Sabbath special. Find a rhythm and make it special. Now, God's given us a rhythm. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. You might not have time for 24 hours of Sabbath, but most of us could spend a couple hours putting our phones away, thinking about how God has been grateful or gracious to us during the week, spending time with people that we love, praying, enjoying the good gifts of food, rest, those kind of things. So whatever your rhythm might be, I would say find a rhythm and make it special. Here would be some specific encouragement from the book Subversive Sabbath. One, start small, but actually start. You're not going to practice Sabbath if you don't practice it. Sabbath is a practice. Swoboda says this, or actually this is John Mark Comer from Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Sabbath will take you a little while to master. This practice is so foreign and alien to our culture, even our church culture, that it might take a while to dial in. That's okay. Remember, you're not in a hurry. So start small, but start. Maybe this week you take an hour-long walk after the church service. Maybe you take a Sabbath nap sometime this afternoon. Maybe you have a Sabbath meal later today. Maybe your Sabbath is later in the week. But start small, don't rush. That author talks about how it's taken him 10 years. Liz and I have been working on something for a year and a half or so. The author Marva Dawn, 30 years of trying to develop her Sabbath practice. So don't rush. Slow down. Start small. Imitate others. I've learned a lot from other people. Last week, my cousin was at our worship service, and she said she and her husband have been practicing Sabbath for a couple years. Some of the things you found in the Sabbath box were directly from her encouragement, some things that they do. We've also picked up some things along the way from other people, from books and podcasts and friends. We were talking with our small group just a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about, in a small group, about how they have a Sabbath meal in the evening and how they're reading scripture together. And sometimes the kids are like, I don't want to, but they're developing a practice. So imitate other people. What we do is we start on Thursday night, we light some candles. We often have a happy hour. We say cheers and a blessing. That's part of our Sabbath practice. We just have a fairly low-key evening together. The kids do have to go to school on Friday. Unfortunately, we can't call the school and say they're Sabbathing, they're not coming. But then Liz and I, we have a leisurely morning together. We pray together. We go for a walk together. We often watch a TV show and eat some food. Sometimes we go out to get it. Sometimes we eat something around the house. There's always a Sabbath nap. We read for pleasure. We call this pleasure stacking, by the way. We just look forward to all of these things and remember that God is with us all day long. You can pick and choose from some of those things, but we want to imitate other people. So you get started, you imitate others, you share it with others, family, kids, small group, the people in this room, wherever you're watching this right now, you share Sabbath with others. And then the last thing I would say is you relax, right? You relax. You're not going to get it all right. You might not even like this idea of Sabbath. Try something, but if it doesn't fit you, maybe experiment a little bit, but don't be legalistic about it. You're gonna try things, you're gonna fail, you're gonna try things, and you're gonna like them, and you're gonna develop this over time. Again, in the book Subversive Sabbath, the author says, make Sabbath mistakes, learn from them. Then enter the next Sabbath with your lesson in hand. Learning how to fail at Sabbath is a critical part of Sabbath. So, is Sabbath appealing? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. What does it do? It reminds us that Jesus is Lord and we live still with sacred time. So we enter Sabbath rest to let Jesus rule. You've got the rest of the day. Go for it.